In the spring of 2019, at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, the Filmmakers for Policy Change student group held the first ever SIPA Oscars. It was a celebration of 6 student-produced digital case studies that had been made the previous year in locations that included Peru, Costa Rica, Vietnam, USA, and Nepal. In this film and in others that we'll share over the next few weeks of this course, you'll have a chance to meet some of the student filmmakers involved in these productions, as well as the team who work with them, including Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker Robert Stone, leading filmmaker activist Paul Redman, and PBS NewsHour correspondent Chris Booker. This film includes interviews with Shreya, Sarah, and Luis from the digital activism team, John and Julie of Private Rainforest Reserves, Daniel of Youth and Crisis Response in Nepal, and Nosher of Act Today, a film on climate variability in Vietnam. We'll also look at films featured in the United Nations Equator Prize, created by a team of student filmmakers and broadcast during the UN Climate Week to a global audience, as well as films featured on PBS's environmental program, Peril and Promise. All these films and digital cases were filmed on location by students and are used by public policy schools and nonprofit groups around the world. We are thrilled to begin in this class a new era of partnership with the Open Society University Network and its many partners around the world. We hope this film and the others like it in this course can help guide you in your own filmmaking journeys. In the fall of 2018, a group of public policy students met to plan to make a documentary that would explore the use of digital technologies in the 2018 U.S. midterm elections.
Online tools absolutely change the way that campaigns are run. That being said, it still does not substitute simple door knocking, talking to people on the phone. That's the most effective way to get out the vote, is still conversation. It's unparalleled.
As the group entered deeper into the complex story, the question of how to give it a clear focus emerged as one of the key challenges.
The class that I took ended up being about student activism in the US midterm elections. That was the focus of our project. And for me, coming in as an international student, I actually had a fairly limited understanding of the US electoral process, which made me a little bit nervous at first in embarking on this case study. But I certainly learned a great deal about the process.
Often it contradicted what the students were actually doing in the very moment, but their actions were influenced by big data. You know, big data was dictating which district to go to and where to canvass, but the actions on the ground weren't necessarily like reflecting these very abstract concepts. So finding ways to relay that through interviews, or perhaps later in the editing process through archival footage and other supplemental interviews, was an interesting challenge.
End of the day, that they were 17, 18, 19-year-old students, and they were kids who had struggled just like every other person that I know, irrespective of whether they're conservatives or whether they're liberals. What mattered was they had a story, and that shaped their value systems, just like it does for everybody else.
They decided to use as their story arc the narrative of 2 groups of student activists. One, a group of college Democrats based in New York City, and the other, a group of college Republicans based in Philadelphia.
Initially, it was a little bit tricky to schedule interviews with some of these college Republicans because coming from a liberal university like Columbia, they were understandably a little bit nervous in engaging with us and wondering why we were reaching out to them. So scheduling the interviews was the first hurdle. And then once we actually got to Philadelphia, making sure that we allocated sufficient time for the interviews on the ground, that we had good locations that we could scout out for the interviews. There were so many logistics that previously I just hadn't appreciated.
Once they had found their basic storyline, they turned their attention to the job of casting the lead characters, and soon realized that choosing which people to focus on would also be one of their main challenges.
Casting is a really difficult decision to make because sometimes there are people that are not what we would say is camera ready, but really are integral to the story or have a high amount of authority and power in the situation, and so it's really important to include them in the scene.
In order to decide who we filmed for the student activism case, we did a lot of online research in the run-up to our field trip to Philadelphia. And we looked at video clips that we could see of individuals that were already online to see how they came across on camera. We also looked at different events that various student groups had put on. One example was the Free Speech Ball, which was a great sort of visual event with a ginormous ball where people could write messages on the ball, and that was a great way of opening up the free speech on campus.
They also gained first-hand experience using smartphone stabilizers in the field, both at events in New York City and on the ground following door-to-door canvassers in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
Shooting with an iPhone is a very effective way to get your, really wide establishing shots to even a medium shot, but it's very difficult to do close-ups and to do, point of view shots and things like that. It can be a little bit more difficult, but I think getting B-roll, as we say, of just, coverage when you're really shadowing someone and you're just following in the moment as a fly on the wall, observing, and you're not getting too involved in their story, I think that the iPhone is incredibly useful.
There was one day that I recall where we were filming out doing some canvassing in Bucks County, and I had the stabilizer and I had my iPhone and I was following a couple of the guys who were door knocking, but the wind was just insane that day. It was blowing an absolute gale and the stabilizer was knocking left and right and left and right, and I had some very shaky footage. So I think it's just important to be aware of conditions like that and maybe try and stand behind the gable end of a house or find a location where you're not impacted by the elements as much.
Another challenge the group faced was finding the locations that would work to film interviews.
We really struggled to try and find places on campus that were quiet enough to let us do these interviews. There was one occasion we were trying to film with Olivia and we ended up setting up in a particular location on campus, only to be told, as we just finalized the lighting, just got the camera focused, everything was ready, we were told by somebody in the building that we were not permitted to film there. We actually ended up filming the interview with Olivia outdoors, sitting in front of one of the student buildings in the evening, and we actually got some great outdoor lighting at that time of night.
But despite these challenges, the final result was a powerful film.
In my experience, having worked on the field with grassroots organizations, not-for-profits and local foundations in India, till my time in New York City, where I've been working with Open Society Foundations for the past year, a common thread has been the fact that grantees or civil society organizations have been unable to tell their stories, and they need help in getting their voices out there. And there is potential for visual storytelling to sort of bridge that gap and give them agency to communicate their message to a wider audience.
Many digital cases followed field research, often conducted on important global issues. In 2018, researchers Nausher Khan and Claire Thibault traveled to Vietnam to work on the issue of climate variability as part of a global study on the impacts of climate change.
Hunger and malnutrition continues to be a major challenge for the world today. One of the key factors in dealing with hunger and food security is climate.
The project is called Act Today, and it is run out of Columbia's International Research Institute for Climate and Society, located across the Hudson from Columbia's main campus.
About 5 years ago, I had a realization that what most resonated with me was hunger. How can we ensure that there is accessibility, availability, and affordability of food for the vast majority of individuals?
They would spend 2 months traveling the country. Neither researcher had formal media training, but they were able to use the smartphones to document their travels in their meetings with local government officials.
Same way I have learned a lot from video, whether it be school feeding programs run in India or Brazil. I intend that videos that I have shot and will continue to shoot will be made available and be a teaching point or a teaching resource for individuals working in this field globally.
Filming with smartphones and stabilizers helped the group gain easy access to the communities they were visiting.
Using this format, the barrier to entry is the easiest, and it's the least intrusive format I've found. And because people are generally pretty accepting of tourists, particularly taking out their phones and filming stuff, I felt like that could have been a barrier if I had gone in with more heavier grade equipment.
As they traveled to new locations, the students were sensitive about how they approached their subjects.
Particularly when you're filming individuals who would otherwise be considered as vulnerable. So would that be women of reproductive age, children, people living below the poverty line, whatever it may be. And getting their consent becomes extremely important. So, you know, the fact that we had a translator there with us who was able to explain everything that we were doing to the population, get their permission beforehand, and then we were able to film, it really made it easier. It's a difficult conversation to have up front, but it makes it easier for the duration of what it is that you're trying to do.
Ultimately, by embedding themselves in the local communities they visited, the students were able to tell a much stronger narrative.
If you want to effectively communicate a story, you have to be personally invested in it. And I feel like any successful journalist is extremely invested in the story. And it was my hope and my understanding that a development practitioner working with the beneficiary community for a year, 2, 3, 5 years, whatever it may be, is also invested in the success of that community, is invested in being a part of that community to a certain degree.
We hope you found these films inspiring as you begin to make your own first films.